I've seen phones go from the Nokia 3310, which at the time felt like the coolest phone in the world.
Well, how can we fix this? How can we get computers to these students who are in many cases refugees?
Sitting here very guilty with my latest upgrade and now thinking, oh my gosh, that's not something I want to repeat.
Hello and welcome back to Hello World, a podcast for educators interested in computing and digital making. I'm James Robinson, computing educator and aspiring environmentalist.
I'm Liz Smart from the Raspberry Pi Foundation. I'm a project writer, data lover and queen of the North, well, in my team at least. As ever, we value any of your comments and feedbacks, which you can share with us now via helloworld.cc/podcast-feedback.
This week, we're thinking about the impact of computing on our climate and how we engage our learners with this really important topic. In particular, we've been reflecting on the challenge of upgrade culture, which drives people to constantly seek out the latest and greatest devices, but also discard what was likely a perfectly serviceable device. We'll be asking this week, does upgrade culture need an upgrade? To kick us off though, let's think about how we can use computing to engage learners in climate science. Liz, I know that you've been thinking a lot about this broader question. Can computing support learners in this area? And if so, how?
Oh, thanks, James. Yeah, it's such an interesting topic. Whenever we create a new set of projects for our young creators, our first step is to look at the kind of projects that they're making already by their online communities, so maybe something like the Scratch community, or entries to the Coolest Project Showcase. And what we found most commonly is that young people are making projects about the environment. So either using technology as a way to solve a specific environmental problem or using technology to raise awareness and to educate people. Hands down, the most common type of entry in any of these things. So yeah, on the back of that, we created a Protect Our Planet path. It's got 6 projects in it. And each project maps to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So they've either got a focus on creating simulations that can monitor the impacts of climate change, or using real world data to create data visualizations and track change over time. We got to work with some great partners. So we work with Ecosia, a German-based social business. They have a search engine. And they plant trees based on users' searches. And we also work with the Shuttleworth Foundation as well, who have electronic tags, and they track turtles off the west coast of South Africa. So it's really great to get some of their data and represent it in our projects. What about you, James? What have you been working on?
Just to go back to what you were saying there about the topic, I think that fact that so many of our learners are already engaged with this topic, and almost you don't have to kind of necessarily sell the idea to them or convince them to think about it. It's something that they really, really care about. And I think for me, the fact that computing is so creative and expressive means that learners can tell stories or investigate ideas or model scenarios using really powerful kind of technology and sort of flex their programming skills, for example. I really love the example you gave about the electronically tagged turtles and the data we can collect. So getting learners to engage with real data is really important. I think something else we have to acknowledge is that, whilst computing has some great benefits to helping us talk about and tackle the environmental challenge, I think we also have to recognise that there is an environmental cost of computing. Either whether we're talking about the amount of energy that's used to kind of sort of run massive data centers and host all this data, to things like AI, which is very kind of it consumes a lot of energy to drive AI systems and mining rigs that we see all around the world. But something that's a bit closer to home is this idea of upgrade culture. I would say I've probably fallen foul of this when I was a little bit younger, but now I'm looking at my device that I've got in my hand, and it's a good 4 or 5 years old now, and I only replaced when I broke it. I left it on the roof of my car and drove off, and it fell on the floor and smashed, so I replaced it, and I haven't had the itch for a while now to upgrade that device. And I think that's something that a lot of people feel, is that kind of drive to upgrade. our devices. And we're going to talk a bit more about that with our two guests today. So, and thankfully, our listeners don't have to listen to us just kind of waffle on. We've got two fantastic guests to help us explore this idea of upgrade culture. So first off, Matt Bowley is a learning manager at Raspberry Pi Foundation. He specialises in online learning content, particularly for secondary teachers and students. And a real passion of Max is to bring discussions into the computing classroom and to encourage students to think critically about technology and the role and impact on their lives. So, Mac, what is upgrade culture and what inspired you recently to write about it for Hello World?
Thanks, James. Upgrade culture is this system, these habits that we seem to have built up around the mobile technology in our lives, be that mobile phones, laptops, tablets. And we seem to have got locked into this sort of cycle of upgrading these devices every 2 to 3 years based on contractual obligations and fashion, more so than the usability of the device, about its fitness for purpose. And the inspiration really was, it comes at the kind of the crux of two interests of mine. One is this rapid development in mobile technology. In my life, I've seen phones go from the Nokia 3310, which at the time felt like the coolest phone in the world, all the way up to sort of the latest iPhones that are basically mini, what would have been considered very, very good computers when the Nokia 3310 came out, in our pockets. So I've always been interested in this because I can see it over the track time of my lifetime improving massively. But also, I think, like a lot of other people, I've had environmental issues on my mind more and more lately. And thinking about ways in my life and in kind of society around me that we can take action to help prevent climate change, but also just reflect a little bit on the way we live our lives. And I too kind of fell foul of this upgrade culture. I always wanted the latest device. I always wanted the newest thing. And as soon as it got to that end of contract period, I would feel like, oh, this device isn't as good anymore. So yeah, it came as a reflection, and I wanted to kind of capture my thoughts in the article and start some discussions, hopefully, with students and teachers.
I can't believe for a second, Mac, that you remember the 3310. You don't seem old enough for that. But there we go. Liz, do you want to introduce our second guest?
Yeah, sure. So also joining us today is James Abela, Head of Computing at Garden International. He's a Raspberry Pi certified educator and founder of the Southeast Asian Computer Science Teacher Association. James, can you give us a bit of a brief overview on Plugged in Malaysia that was started by one of your students?
Yeah, literally, when he was 16, we were all in lockdown in Malaysia, and he wanted to do something. In particular, we obviously had students who were very much in need. They were locked down. They were in quite a bad situation in some ways, that they weren't getting any education. And he was like, well, how can we fix this? How can we get computers to these students who are in many cases refugees? And so what he did was he literally went door to door. And like anything, getting that first computer was a lot of effort. But then as things moved on, he got more and more computers, and he was able to put them in, recycle them, and get them into the centres, which was absolutely incredible.
I really loved reading this article because it kind of was a really great example of turning when we talk to Mac, we're going to present as a bit of a problem, this sort of upgrade culture and sort of, creating this surplus of equipment and turning that into a solution which benefits other people. So what before we kind of delve into that, what was the impact of the project, James, on the learners that your student was trying to support?
I mean, basically, he's helped almost 1,000 students one way or another, because he's managed to recycle quite a large number. And it keeps on growing, because once he got that snowball rolling, more and more people were willing to help him. And now he's got a team of volunteers to help him. So it really is an incredible story as to how far he's got.
That's brilliant. Where did he get the machines from?
Initially, he got them from neighbors. But then he realized that a lot of companies, they need reliable computers. So after 3 to 5 years, they replace all their computers. And as part of their governance and charitable giving, they were very happy to give him computers. He would clean them up, sort them, make sure they were highly maintained, and then he was able to dish them out. So that was a win-win for the organization, who could be seen as being helping charities, and it was a win for him because he was then able to do things.
And just sort of to kind of loop back a little bit, I think we've talked a little bit about upgrade culture and the fact that it leads to us having a surplus of devices, or sort of upgrading our device rapidly. and we've talked about the environmental impact, but for some of our listeners, that may not be a direct kind of link between us upgrading our device and the environmental impact. Matt, do you want to just talk a little bit more about what the impact of this culture is and how it is damaging our environment?
Absolutely. I think we need to consider what we do here as part of a global movement, right? So even though these devices aren't necessarily being manufactured here in the UK or wherever you live, it has an impact on the world as a whole, right? So inside of your mobile phone and all kind of mobile devices are not only batteries, but also loads of rare chemical elements that are, I think it's a huge percentage of the periodic table is included in some way in your mobile phone. And to get those, they obviously need to be mined. And those resources are depleting, but are also in high demand. And so a lot of the companies that are sort of mining these are incentivized to get as much of it out as cheaply as possible. And so, as you can imagine, that sort of leads to mining practices that are less than ethical or environmentally friendly. And so those impacts might not be felt close to where you live, but you have to consider all environmental impacts on a global scale now. We need to work together to combat the climate crisis. And so upgrading our devices and creating that demand where we live means that the environmental impacts will sort of add to the global, greenhouse gases, energy usage, and depleting resources.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, and you say not close to home, but in Malaysia it very much is close to home, and you see the way that they're mining those things, and it's open top, it's stripping out rainforest. It really is bad, and all they can do once they've done their mining is create a water lake, a very deep lake that's dangerous in itself, but that's all they can do with that land afterwards. And in some cases, you've taken away really good arable land to do it.
And that brings me on to a question that I had, and about the sort of the impact. We talk about this being a global kind of issue, and I think the drive to upgrade, this upgrade culture, is probably something we feel more in developed countries, in Western nations, maybe more to an extent. Does this affect society equally, both the drive to upgrade, but also the idea that what we're doing here has an impact on environment and culture elsewhere?
I think, as there's so many technological issues, of course, it doesn't affect everybody equally. I think along kind of socioeconomic lines, definitely people with less tend to feel the impacts more. As James said, where the mining practices are happening isn't necessarily where the upgrades are happening, and so they are kind of bearing the brunt really of our obsession with new devices or the fastest, latest thing. But there's also sort of a divide within who has the ability to upgrade, and what we put technology on a pedestal, and not everybody can afford to change their phone every 2 to 3 years and keep up with the latest trends. And we put so much value and so much status on these new devices that it really we're kind of feeding this negative cycle from both ends, right? Like one side, we're taking things out that we're not able to put back in, but on the other side, we're also making people feel worse for not doing that. And so I think it really requires us to kind of have discussions like this one, and hopefully ones in classrooms as well, where we think about like the status that we put on new devices. Do we actually need a new device every 3 years? Or can we find ways to keep using ours for as long as possible? Or, as James's student found, ways to recycle those devices so that they can go to other places and be put to use and get into the hands of people who need them.
I know I'm sitting here very guilty with my latest upgrade and now thinking, oh my gosh, that's not something I want to repeat in the future. I'm definitely going to get out of this mindset. I think one thing I was wondering about is, and James, you probably would have found this and found a solution, but I don't know what can be repaired or not. And I tend to kind of sit on things even at home. And you've been talking about everything, all the elements that go into creating a mobile phone. But how did you go with your project, James, about upgrading the devices? How easy was that to recycle?
That's the other thing is some manufacturers are generally pretty good and allow you to organize and sort things, and often the ones that are aimed at the corporate environment, they are easy to upgrade, fix, and change because they're designed that way. But a lot of the consumer devices, you need special repair kits, you need this, you need that. Some of them are even blocking off CPUs to the motherboards. You name it, they're doing it. One really good website is iFixit, because that really tells you what's needed. And in a lot of cases, a good old cleanup and a sort out is all that's needed to keep them in good nick. The other problem we have in Malaysia is that a lot of devices overheat very regularly. So fans and things like that are often the first to go.
Yeah, I think this is such a good point. One of the biggest ways we can combat this is by encouraging the right to repair. And I think you made such a good point there, James, about lots of companies are sort of, for consumer devices anyway, almost actively working against this. I mean, we've all seen sort of the latest scandals with Apple where the cameras are sort of ID'd to specific processors, so you can't even replace them with a like-for-like part unless you go to a Apple store. And so I think another thing that we can really do is push companies to make devices easier to repair, and also to educate each other on what goes into our devices, because it does come from a place of not understanding what goes in there, and therefore you don't feel as comfortable to try and repair or even to search out repairs if you're not sure what's going wrong. So I think there's a kind of educational angle to this, which is if we all kind of understood our devices a little bit better, understood the magic box, then we might feel more empowered to get it repaired and to clean it out and get a bit more hands-on with our devices rather than sort of throwing them out as a first resort.
There's a really great creator on TikTok who's regular. Their videos regularly come up on my feed, but they basically, someone sends them the phone, it's broken, it won't power on, and they go, right, well, let's fix it, and they fix it in like a 2-minute video. And typically it involves turning it on, looking for heat, finding the thing that's broken, taking it off, putting a new one on, bang, done. And he makes it look so easy. He's got a few specialist tools, but actually it's not that complicated. And even if you can't do it yourself, there are services. I recently damaged the screen of my phone, and I just happened to find that my phone provider had a really long warranty. So I sent it off, got a new screen, all sorted, came back, no charge. And it was like, actually, that was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be.
So, James, obviously, like your Plugged in Malaysia is just an amazing project, and I just wondered, like, I'm not even sure if there's anything like that near where I live, and how to even start that. Have you got any tips on kind of how to get going?
I think if you're around the UK, I think there's a project called Restart, which is trying to do that kind of thing. And I think that's really powerful. What we have is the advantage in Malaysia is that we have very easy access to the Chinese manufacturers. So we've got this website called Lazada, and we can actually order individual bits and pieces and all of these kind of things and really get down to the individual components. And it is really, really useful for us because we can get things straight from China and it takes a week or two. Whereas I know getting things into the UK is a lot more effort. And you can't just get straight at the manufacturer in China who was making that original part. And you know how the price goes up and up and up. But if you have that direct access, you can repair things a lot easier. I know somebody who had a real problem with their iPhone, their Apple Pencil. Well, he got onto Lazada, and a week or two later, he got that specialist tool for very little money to fix his Apple Pencil. So they do exist, but it's harder in Western cultures to get directly at the Chinese parts.
And I guess the other thing that is required here is some of the skills, right? So you had a student with a passion and an interest, and I think maybe there are things that we can do as educators to help foster that interest. And I think Matt was saying earlier on about people not necessarily knowing what's going on under the hood of their device, so they can't really access that repair kind of approach. So I think there are probably things that we can do as educators to help students get a bit more kind of familiar with the inside of the computer, whether that's just having some junk parts at the back that you can kind of rebuild, or a computer that's sort of stripped down to its motherboard and running outside of its case or something. Like, has anyone done things like that with their learners?
I mean, I have quite often, and sometimes we make them into display pieces because, a lot of my students now have the hobby that they want to make desktop machines. And one of the advantages we have is that if they mess it up, there's normally a local shop who will help fix it and get it sorted for not too much money. But yeah, gaming PCs and desktop PCs and getting the most out of them has really encouraged our students to really get started and have a go. And also, there are quite a lot of second-hand shops out here in Malaysia who will take these parts and fix them and try and do it. So it's a little bit more visible here. Whereas I kind of wish the old second-hand store wasn't available or was come back to the UK, and the US.
And I think there's another side to it as well, which is we already teach a lot about computer systems in lessons anyway. And so there are so many opportunities within that to explore real world devices, whether it's through teardowns like James mentioned, but also in just, rather than just telling people what RAM is, describe what an adequate amount of RAM would be for currently. And so people can better assess their current devices to see if they are fit for purpose, rather than sort of following, marketing that says, the new device is this much better than your old device. So I think there's lots of opportunities within the sort of systems that we already use to kind of get people more hands-on and combat that fear that some people have about, opening devices, getting under the hood, that they might break it.
I was speaking to Siobhan, who works at Code Club New Zealand, and they have a good initiative there where they recognise, especially with the pandemic, there was just such a gap in access to a device, and they got a process going where they actually used high school students to repair and get accreditation for repairing the devices that were then sent out to the younger children. I thought that was a really good initiative, a good way of like getting them involved in actually repairing things and also recognized for the work that they were doing too.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it's having the space for those repair clubs that's really handy.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you've got something that kids can engage in, they enjoy, and results in something that's productive and useful for that community or wider society, and also those skills that they're going to be developing and being able to repair equipment helps feed the kind of this sort of industry in this space further down the line. Matt, you also make a point in your article about Raspberry Pi, because obviously we've got the sort of the trading company produced these devices, and I think one of the original ideas behind Raspberry Pi was to kind of pitch hardware that was a little bit older. It wasn't quite up to spec with really sort of super fast computers that we have that on our desktops, but was good enough to run certain applications. And I think you had a chat with Eben, the CEO of the trading company, didn't you, to kind of to explore this a bit more. Do you want to add anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We after writing the article, we thought it would be a bit disingenuous to not also look at, as part of Raspberry Pi being a computer manufacturer as well, not to have a look at our practices. So sat down with Eben and kind of spoke through the way he thinks about sustainability, not only in producing the computers, but also in the additional hardware. So we've done lots of work, particularly around the accessories, to try and reduce the amount of plastic we're using, to try and reduce the amount of packaging in general that those things get sent in. But also with the Raspberry Pis, like we've kept that ethos of older hardware, but letting people get hands on with it. And I think some of the newer models, even though they're built into keyboards and stuff, you still have access to those GPIO pins. So that is kind of quite central. So I think the Raspberry Pi ethos is and will continue to be, you can touch this computer. And Eben was kind of quite strongly pro that, always making sure that it was very open, that we were encouraging people to have a go, to look at the computer and not be afraid of what's behind the magic box and not touching it and only taking it to geniuses to fix it. So I think Raspberry Pi's done a great job of that, and I hope we continue to do so.
I think when you're in the classroom or when you're in a club and the young people actually get to see a Raspberry Pi or something similar and actually see the insides of it, there is like a oh wow kind of magic moment when you actually realize that you can touch it and you can take it apart. And it would be really good to explore other ways to take that interest then and that excitement and to build on it to help with the repair side as well.
I mean, that's the other thing, is the Raspberry Pi is a really good substitute if the rest of your computer doesn't work. But if the monitor's working, the CPU is normally the most expensive bit, but obviously on a Raspberry Pi, you're looking at $30 to $50 basically, aren't you?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things we saw during the pandemic as well, like other people's responses to kind of equipping some of their students. If they couldn't recycle or get hold of machines, often it was let's look at a low cost machine that we can put in that space in its place. I'm just going to just sort of wrap up some of that stuff around. I think that engaging with the hardware is really useful. And when we were talking about it, it sort of made me reflect on this idea of, which we might have come across, this idea of the notional machine. And so students, when they come to doing things like programming or making videos or storing images, they don't always understand what's going on under the hood. And I think getting hands-on with the device, understanding where the CPU is and what it's doing and how it works with the memory and what the motherboard's for, all of this gives the students a sense of what the machine is, how it works, and helps them build their notional machine to then build other concepts on top of. So I think it's really helpful.
It really allows you to build it up, doesn't it, from the ground up, when
Absolutely.
you understand it that way.
And by teaching students these things, we're actually empowering them to go into their homes and be an advocate for that within their families as well, right? So often you'll find that, you have the one sort of techie person in the family who gets the devices when they're broken. So I think if we can encourage kids to share these things with their family, then we're only going to be spreading that further and further, right? And hopefully more families will have a dedicated repair person, or at least someone who knows who to call.
Absolutely. And my final question, I guess, was, we've sort of talked a little bit about engaging students with some of these tangible things, fixing the device, getting hands-on. But some of this, particularly when we're talking about our impact on the climate and, us having some sort of collective responsibility, like those are quite challenging things sometimes to engage our learners with. So how do we think we go about those? And I think, Matt, you've written a little bit about this, or I know this is something that you're quite passionate about, engaging students in discussions. So how do you think we address these things with our learners?
Yeah, I mean, I think leading classroom discussions, allowing opinions to kind of flow about, what is fit for purpose for a device. At what point do you think we should upgrade, and letting students kind of develop their own ideas, because that is really the secret to it, isn't it? Don't be guided by marketing, because of course they want you to buy a new device as soon as possible. Instead, have your own opinions and your own ideas of what you want that device to do. And if that device is still doing that, then it's still fit for purpose, right? Rather than necessarily looking to external marketing devices or the manufacturers of these things for that. So I think any discussions that promote opinion generation in your students, so what is a good amount of time to have a mobile phone, when do you need a new laptop, these sorts of things I think are super beneficial.
And you've got there's a really nice course, isn't there, on Future Learn, I think, about holding classroom discussions that would be really nice. If you're a computing teacher and you're not quite sure how to engage some of your students, there are some strategies and techniques and topics that we can find in that course. And we'll link to that in the show notes. James?
I just think also we should fight this like we should fight fast fashion. I've got a mobile phone that's 3 years and it's plenty good enough for me. And I'm just hoping that, maybe I need to replace the battery or something, or maybe I need to reset it and restart it. But while the hardware is there, I think we should just be happy with the devices. And we are saving ourselves quite a lot of money when we do that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as ever on our podcast, I found our guest today fascinating and full of some really useful insights for talking to learners about the issues around climate and computing. We asked our audience, how do we engage our learners in issues around the impact of computing on the climate, and as well as some of the solutions that we might have? And we've got a couple of interesting responses. Liz?
Yeah, so John Mercer got in touch, a computer science teacher, and was lucky enough to be part of an excellent pilot run by Apps for Good. And it's a climate change course that John says is going to launch very soon. So that's exciting. Apparently, it was a really great way to talk positively about how technology can help leading students to develop their own solutions and having a real world impact. That's great. Thanks, John.
It's a really good example, and I really like the Apps for Good content, who actually got in touch with John and the podcast to say yes, that they're putting that course out there. It's going to be available in the next academic year for anyone that's interested, and we'll provide a link to that course in the show notes. If you have a question or a comment about our discussion today, then you can email us via podcast@helloworld.cc, or you can tweet us at helloworld_edu. My thanks to Mac and to James for sharing their time, experiences, and expertise around this challenging area of computing and sustainability. So, Liz, what did we learn today?
Oh, I learned so much. One thing I'm going to commit to, if we come back together as a group in like 5 years' time, I'm going to have this same phone. I promise you that. But also, I'm really, really excited to look at the local solutions for Plugged in Malaysia, so I can do something similar with devices that are lurking around my house and at my Coder Dojo that are no longer used really and could be repaired and be really useful for someone else. So definitely going to do those things. Thank you.
And I learned that all the computer parts in my cupboard are not junk I'm sitting on a wealth of resources that could be reused.